So it's great to be here. I think there's some, as you were discussing earlier, I think there's some advantages to Zoom meetings, but probably a combination of virtual and physical meetings would be a good idea. And we've all learned from this period, but as Karen said, it certainly enabled you to reach people, speakers that you might not otherwise have done, and similarly for writers like myself to reach audiences that we wouldn't have reached before. So I'm very happy to be here. As Karen mentioned, I'm a former journalist. I then worked for a time, for several years, for the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. Actually, my job was to research modern day genocides, particularly Rwanda, Yugoslavia. But then I was asked to help out on an exhibit that the museum is put on, devoted to the question of how America responded to the Holocaust. It's called Americans and the Holocaust. And when the museum reopens, hopefully fairly soon, you can, if you're in Washington, you can visit that exhibit. So this question of America's response to the rise of Nazi Germany really falls into two main areas. One is the question of refuge. The rise of Hitler created a refugee crisis, a huge refugee crisis in Europe. And Jews wanted to get out of Germany, other countries that the Nazis had occupied. And the question is, where could they go? So we look at that. And we also look at, there's a related question, but somewhat later, but it's a different, slightly separate question, a question of rescue. Once the Holocaust started, was it possible to actually rescue Jews who'd been sent to the camps? And that's a very controversial subject, but I don't really deal with that in my book. I look at the first question, the question of refuge and the US record in dealing with this refugee crisis in the 1930s, which is also a controversial subject. And so I'm going to try to share my screen here. I have some slides that might be helpful. So let me just start this. Okay. Right, so you should see the screen now, right? Everybody can see the screen, good. Okay, so here's my book, The Unwanted, and the subtitle is America, Auschwitz, and a Village Caught in Between. So I'll just explain a little bit about the title and the subtitle. So the title really comes from a slogan that the Nazis plastered all over Germany. Jews are unwanted here. Juden sind hier unerwünscht. So they made clear to German Jews, because they were Germans in addition to being Jews, that there was no future for them in Germany. And the question is, were they wanted anywhere else? We know they weren't wanted in Nazi Germany. So particularly after Kristallnacht, huge numbers of Jews from Germany and other countries like Austria that were occupied by the Nazis tried to leave. And they went to the US consulates, put in their immigration applications, because immigration was the only way you could actually get to the US in those days. There wasn't there was no such thing as a refugee status. You come as a visitor or as an immigrant. So I was interested in this question of, what happened to all these visa applications? And we illustrated this in the museum by building a paper, what we called a paper wall, you can see on the left of the screen there, which is all the bureaucratic procedures you had to go through in order to obtain that precious piece of paper that would entitle you to immigrate to the United States. You had, not just the American bureaucracy, you had to deal with the German bureaucracy. You had to deal with customs. You had to fulfill, various tax obligations. There was sort of mountains of paper that you had to accumulate in order to reach the United States or any other country that was accepting Jewish refugees. In fact, there's a book called The Paper Wall that describes this period in American immigration policy. Now, lots of people, including the author of The Paper Wall, have written about the obstacles to immigration in the US during this period. But what I think is new about my book is that I connected this debate in the United States to what was going on actually among the people who were trying to reach the United States. And then I also bring in the US consuls who had the responsibility of actually issuing these immigrant visas. So I, connected the three aspects of the story. There's the US government, the Congress, the people who are the policymakers in Washington, the people implementing the policy, i.e. the US consuls, and the people affected by the policy trying to reach the United States. Now, I ended up, just to make this more human, because you can describe it in sort of global terms or political terms, but I wanted to understand how the US policies affected actual people trying to reach the United States. So I chose a little village in the Black Forest area of Southwest Germany, a little place called Kippenheim, across the Rhine River from Alsace. And you can see a photograph of the village on the right of the screen. It was a village of about 1,500 people in the 30s, and there's still about 1,500 people living there now. And on this photograph, again from the 30s, you can see the church, which is shared between Lutherans and Catholics, and the schoolhouse, and the rat house, the town council. And here on the right of the screen, I don't know if it's obscured by the photographs of us, video of us, but there's a magnificent Moorish synagogue that was built in the middle of the 19th century. So there's a mixed village of Catholics, Lutherans, Protestants, and Jews. Actually, the Jews were a minority. They were only about 150 Jews living in this place. But they've been living there for about 200 years. They first came to this area of Germany. They were brought there to help defend the frontiers of the Holy Roman Empire, Germany, against France in the late 18th century. So, and they're well integrated into German life. Many Kippenheim Jews, their families look back on the 19th century when Jews were being integrated into German life and obtaining the full rights of citizens as a kind of golden age. And this was a period when they created businesses. They weren't allowed to own land for a long period of time, but so that meant that many went into trades, particularly cattle trade in this rural area. So they were, particularly in this village, I mean, it differed in other villages, but in this village, the Jewish population was well integrated, and many of them were middle class with operating successful businesses. Okay, so why did I choose, of all the villages in Germany where Jews had settled, why did I choose Kippenheim to write about? I did so because I came across some photographs of a deportation of Kippenheim Jews in October of 1940, not to the east, but to the west. And I hadn't realized this before I did the research for this book, that before the deportations began to the east, there was what we would now call an ethnic cleansing operation. In October of 1940, the local Gauleiters of Baden and the neighboring district decided to round up all their Jews overnight, put them on trucks, take them to train stations, and send them across the border to France, which had just been occupied by the Germans, i.e. to get rid of them all. So we actually have photographs of this deportation where it's possible to identify the people in the photographs. On the left-hand side of the screen, you can see this is the Meyer family. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see Max and Fanny Walfer. Now, they were sent, as I said, not to the east, but to France, where the French put them in a camp in Gurs, where conditions were terrible, but it wasn't a death camp. It was a concentration camp. The French also wanted to get rid of them. So when they arrived in France, they'd all applied for American visas, mainly in Stuttgart, which was the closest American consulate. When they got to France and put in this terrible camp called Gurs, they all applied through the US consulate for their visa applications to be transferred from Germany to France. And they continued, with the help of their relatives who were already abroad, to try to reach the United States. So it's a kind of very interesting subgroup of about 7,000, 8,000 people who were German Jews who were attempting to reach the United States, first from Germany and then later from a French camp. And I wanted to find out what happened to the people in the photographs who it's possible to identify. So just to simplify this story, we have 5 or 6 photographs from Kippenheim of deportations, and there are other Jewish families I follow from Kippenheim, but today I'm just going to talk about these 2 families because they really illustrate the differing fates of people who were, caught up in this ethnic cleansing movement and people who were trying to reach the United States from Europe. So first of all, this is Max and Fanny Walfer. Max was the cigarette distributor for this region. And here he is being loaded onto the truck with his wife, Fanny, under the guise of an SS officer. You can see on the right of the photograph, it's in full daylight. You can even see a farmer leading his cow through the street, some people with their children looking on as the Jews are being deported. They were allowed to take a couple of suitcases with them, but what makes this photograph remarkable is not only do we have the photograph, but then we also have some correspondence from the Walfers when they arrived in Gurs. And Fanny wrote to her relatives in England and the United States when she got to Gurs, and I'll quote from a letter that she wrote from Gurs about this deportation. She says, "I packed so much in 2 hours. They were only given 2 hours to pack everything and leave the house. But most of it, the Herren, i.e. the Herren was, she was still referring to the SS by a code name, the Herren, the gentleman, ironic, threw back into the house. No linen, no clothes, none of the things that your dear Papa and I had acquired over the years. We have become beggars. I still cannot grasp that we have become so poor and helpless. My eyes hurt from crying. Kind, sweet children, don't forget us. Go to the Jewish committee over there," she means in the UK or the US, "and do all that's necessary so that we can get some relief from the mess that we're in." So that's a good sort of window into her state of mind when she arrived in Gurs, wanting to get out of Gurs as quickly as possible. Now we also have testimony from relief workers who were in southern France. This part of southern France, by the way, France was divided into 2 after the German invasion. There was the northern part that was under the control of the Germans directly, and there was the southern part that was technically unoccupied, Vichy France, but it was still sort of influenced by German policy. But the camps there were run not by the Germans, but by the French. So, and there were American relief workers or foreign relief workers who were trying to help the refugees who had arrived there. Varian Fry writes in February of 1941, the visa rigmarole here is inhuman. It's almost killing the refugees. They have to wait in corridors and lines over and over again until their very souls must be shriveled and shrunken by the experience. Now, what is interesting about the Valfas is that also there's a lot you can follow their immigration case in a very detailed way, both through American records and through the records of the agencies that were trying to help them, including HISEM was one of them, the Quakers, and through their correspondence with their family. And so they, made every effort to get their American visas. They were in a long line. There was a quota applied to German Jews. So only a certain number of Germans, including German Jews, were allowed into the country in any 1 year. And basically you had to wait in line until your turn came. And as soon as there were all these kind of obstacles to getting a successful visa application, but there were some external obstacles that kind of complicated things. For example, in June of 1940, France falls, and here in the United States, there's what was known at the time as the kind of fifth column scare, fifth column mania. Everybody believes that the Germans were attempting to infiltrate spies into the US under the guise of refugees, among other things. It was rather like after 9/11, everybody was on the watch out for terrorists. So even President Roosevelt says, after the invasion of France, that the refugee has to be checked because unfortunately there are some spies hidden among the refugee flow, as has been found in other countries. He means other European countries. Eleanor had she was more focused on the humanitarian question, and she writes in one of her columns at this period, are we going to be swept away by our traditional attitude, towards civil rights by hysteria about fifth columnists, or are we going to keep our heads? So you can see there's this debate in the United States about what to do with refugees, with immigrants trying to reach the United States. It's become a very political question. There are very passionate feelings in Congress about it, in the press, and this debate has even reached inside the Roosevelt family, around the Roosevelt family table. I said, whenever something happened in the case of the Valfas that seemed to give them hope, something else would happen that, set back their application. And the very good example of that is that they were invited to the US consulate in Marseille in December of 1941. And they had every expectation that they were about to receive their immigration visas. They seemed to reach the head of the line. And the day before they showed up at the consulate, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And as a result of that, the US is suddenly at war with Nazi Germany, and all these German Jews are considered enemy aliens. Even though they'd been expelled by Germany, they were still German citizens in the eyes of the US immigration authorities. So what that meant in practical terms was that, Max showed up at the consulate and he was told, well, he wasn't rejected, but he was said, we have to check your case more. We have to see that, you're not a spy or a subversive trying to enter the United States. So it meant further delays. And committees were formed in the United States to screen all these visa applications. And they had a son who had already reached the United States who went to Washington and appeared before the committee and finally managed about 6 months later to convince them that his parents were not spies in disguise. And he obtains the committee approves the visa application. And Karl Walfer writes to his parents in July of 42, God willing, you'll soon be able to set foot in this wonderful country. I see you, my dears, trying to keep the tears from your cheeks. This is in July 1942. But as fate would have it, German policy changes at that point, and it's precisely in the summer of 1942 that they decide to start sending people, Jews, to the death camps from countries like France in Western Europe. And they tell the French Vichy government to hand over all these foreign Jews, I mean, all the Jews, but beginning with the foreign Jews, the German Jews. So instead of making it to the United States, the Walfers and many of the other of these deportees who had ended up in Gurs and other French camps are, instead of making it to the United States, are deported first to Paris and then to Auschwitz, where they are presumably, I mean, almost certainly killed soon after they arrive in Auschwitz in August of 1942. So contrast that story with the story of that other family that I showed you, the Meyer family, which is actually a 3-generational family. They're also given 2 hours to leave their house. They live actually just around the corner from, here's the Meyer family. The Walfers live just around the corner. Truck is going around Kippenheim to pick all these Jewish families up. You can see here the neighbors' kids watching, actually the neighbors are sort of watching from the windows. They've been told to shutter their house, to leave the key in the door. There's a 10-year-old boy here, his older brother and his mother already on the truck. There's his grandparents and his father leaving the house in October of 1940. Anyway, they also get to Gurs, are deported to Gurs. The grandfather dies in Gurs from a typhoid epidemic that's rampant in the camps in this period. There's terrible malnutrition and so on and so forth. So a lot of these people die in the French camps, but the Walfers, the father, the mother, and the 2 kids make it to the United States. And one of the reasons I decided to write this book was that I was able to track down Kurt Walfer, here a 10-year-old boy, and here about a vigorous 80-something-year-old man. I Googled him and found out that he worked as a cataloger of German books at the Library of Congress, which is very close to the Holocaust Museum on the Mall in Washington. So I wrote him and asked him if he would be willing to talk to me, and he very kindly agreed. And in fact, one time I went back to Kippenheim with him. It turned out that he goes back every year, or almost every year. He missed the last year because of the COVID. But he goes back every year at the invitation of German hosts to give talks in schools and churches and so on. Anyway, I describe how they made it out of France. They were given their granted their American visas. It's a sort of long odyssey they had to make via North Africa, Algeria, but they made it to the US. And Kurt, had a successful career as a librarian, writer in the US. Anyway, he gives these talks, and I went to one of them at the school. I took this photograph. And when he shows the shows the kids the photograph, the German kids, he always ends by showing a photograph of his American visa, which you can see up on the left-hand side of the screen here. And here's a close-up of that visa. And it's not just one stamp you had to acquire. You had to acquire, dozens of them. And everyone was vital. The immigration visa, the stamp from the customs, the exit visa, the transit visas, and so on and so forth. So this is his American visa, which he still has, all these years later. And when he gives these talks, he always ends by saying, these stamps saved our lives. If you were missing just one stamp, you could die. This was the most precious document I ever possessed. Those stamps saved our lives. Now, sort of articulating that in a slightly different kind of way was an American journalist called Dorothy Thompson, who was a reporter in Nazi Germany in the 30s. And she actually even interviewed Hitler. And she covered the refugee crisis as a reporter in the 30s. And she wrote a book about the refugee crisis. And among the other things she writes in her book, it's a fantastic commentary on the inhumanity of our times, meaning the 30s, that for thousands and thousands of people, a piece of paper with a stamp on it is the difference between life and death. So that was really the goal, and the starting point of my book was to investigate these pieces of paper, how they were handed out, what the policy was, what you had to do to obtain them, and to look at the differing fates of the people who succeeded in obtaining the pieces of paper and the unfortunate people who didn't obtain these life-giving pieces of paper. So I think I'll end there, but very happy to answer your questions about Kippenheim or about US immigration policy or about, in general, about this period. And there's also quite an interesting sort of post-war story about, the battle or the war for memory. Would people, how would Germans remember this? How would Jews remember this? How would the historiography of the Holocaust? But I think I'll stop there, and happy to answer your questions, or if you've any comments, please go right ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. It was very interesting in how you highlighted these, two families. Many of us have our own stories, but it's always important to remember that there are so many others who had these tragedies. I see we have already a hand raised. Doris, if you would unmute.
Yes, you mentioned Roosevelt, and from what I understand, he never even used the quota that was available. And I believe Morgenthau tried to influence him and was unsuccessful. And I think, all right, I'll be frank. I have never forgiven. I'm a proud American, but I have never forgiven the United States for this. Both the non-Jews and the Jews living here, I'll be honest about it. I lost my whole family. And
so can I ask where they came from?
Yes, they came from a little town called Mechanisch, which is between Köln and Aachen, close to Belgium. In other words, it's the other side of the Ardennes almost. It's
right.
the German side.
Yeah.
So my whole paternal family was lost, both near and a family that supposedly had been schlepped in via Aachen in Roman times. Well, of course, there's no proof of that, but we were there before Napoleon because there are records of being there when Napoleon showed up. And Roosevelt, I believe, might have said he's scared of spies and fifth columnists, but there might have been something else an old-time anti-Semitism that was in the United States already then?
Mhm.
It's, if you'd like to answer that. This was not something new to the United States either.
Right. Can I ask, did your these relatives or your family were they trying to reach the United States? Where were they trying to? Had they applied for visas or
I
what?
can only talk about my father.
Mhm.
The others were murdered.
Mhm.
My father came from a family, his parents and 5 siblings. There were 5 children. He was very politically aware, always. And in 1933, they came from the same little town. He told my mother terrible, he read a lot. He did not finish high school because of the First World War, when everyone had to try and work. And he was born in 1911. And he was very politically aware. And he said terrible things are coming. And he tried very early to get out wherever he could. His first choice, he was a Zionist already as a boy. He was, of course, what was then Palestine. And you could not trust, you couldn't rely on the Brits. He would have gone anywhere, anywhere. So it was Israel, Palestine, United States, or anywhere. And he was saved he got to South Africa. It's too long a story. I don't want to tell it.
No,
Right.
let's
Okay, it's right. Well, let me reply to, was try to give you some context about, I mean, the main question you raised was about FDR and US immigration policies. So, I mean, you know, some of these stories end tragically and some, I mean, your father got out eventually, or he got to South Africa, as I understand it, right?
Yes.
So let me just talk about FDR because, you know, it's the first question that everybody asks. Now I'm going to show you, I just want to sort of put some context into this debate because it's, you know, very lively debate and people have got strong views about FDR. So I'm going to actually share the screen again and show you a couple of slides that kind of illustrate what was happening in the US at this time. Okay, so you mentioned the question of quota visas.
Yes.
I mean, as I explained, there was a immigration quotas to the US and they were set by Congress. And actually the German quota was quite generous. It was almost 26,000 Germans were allowed to immigrate every year to the United States. The British quota was also generous. The Chinese quota, there wasn't, was 0. So there was discrimination against, you know, Asians, against various other people, but Europeans tended to be favored. But within Europe, the Germans and, you know, West Europeans, Northern Europeans were much more favored over East Europeans. And there you can, there probably is some anti-Semitism in that, you know, the Polish quota was, and the Russian quota and the Yugoslav quota was much lower than the German quota. But the German quota, by the comparing to other quotas, was fairly generous. And in 1938, the German quota was combined with the Austrian quota. The two were put together. So it was 27,000 people were allowed to immigrate every year from Germany and Austria to the United States. Now, if you look at this graph, you can see precisely, you know, the question of filling the quotas. At the early 30s, the quotas were, you know, only filled in a tiny amount. Partly that was because in 32, 33, there wasn't a huge sort of demand for immigration from Germany. Then in the 30s, the demand obviously increased, and it became a flood after 1938, particularly after Kristallnacht, or even the middle of 1938. Now, for the first part of the 30s, it's also true that they were very restrictive in interpreting these quotas. And the quotas were not filled. I mean, by 36 onwards, they could probably have filled the quota to 100%, and they didn't fill the quota to 100%. The quota was filled. I mean, it's not true that the quota was never filled. The quota was filled for essentially for 2 years between the middle of 1938. You look at the years from the middle to the middle. So the middle of 1938 to the middle of 1940, the quota was filled for those 2 years. So partly, FDR, he actually relaxed the interpretation of the quota in 37, 38 as this crisis sort of came to a peak. I mean, you may say that he should have done a lot of other things. That's no doubt true. But in terms of the quota, they filled the quota for those 2 years. Now let's look at the two countries that Jews were trying to reach predominantly. There was the United States, predominantly the United States and Palestine. In the early 30s, Palestine was much easier to reach than the United States. And the British policy was fairly liberal. They were accepting people into the what was then the British Mandate of Palestine. In 1937, they start, as you explained, they start making it much more difficult. So immigration to Palestine goes precipitously down in 37. It's actually at that time that it goes up to the United States. So, the bottom line here is that between them, the US and Palestine admitted more Jewish refugees than any other part of the world. And in fact, the more Jewish refugees ended up in Palestine, in the US, than any other country in the world. I mean, you have to set, your criticisms of FDR and the US administration, are well-founded, but you have to, there's a kind of gray area here. There are things to be said that were problematic about FDR and the US administration, and there are things to be said that are more on the positive side. I can go into a little more detail if you like, but I don't think, of course there was anti-Semitism in this period in America. And, there were people in the State Department who you can identify from their writings as being anti-Semitic. And there were some consuls who would oppose to letting Jews in. That's why you have to look at it right down to the level of the consuls. I personally do not believe that FDR was anti-Semitic. I think that's an unfair accusation against him. But, there's room for debate about this. So in my book, I've tried to show the two sides of this story. There were many people who didn't make it to the US, who could have been admitted without damaging US national security. And there were other people who made it to the US, like the Meyer family. And I'm sure you can all think of, other examples. But, we have to, I think we should celebrate the people who made it here and be, the fate of the people who didn't make it here is, of course, tragic. And it's quite correct to say that, the US could have done more to admit more refugees during this period. But I'd like to sort of look at it in a kind of balanced way rather than just as a simple indictment of the administration. That's my conclusion after studying this. I didn't begin with a preconceived judgment before I studied it.
We have a question from Eleanor. Put on mute.
So even when people got here, I'm talking about my relatives, my mother's family. One of her brothers was arrested with his wife and 2 kids from a town in Poland. Their lucky day sent to a slave labor camp in Siberia. Her parents, her other 3 brothers, sister, their children were murdered. So now here's the family in Siberia, and they made it to a DP camp in Germany after the war. For my mother to bring that family to the US, she had to have a furnished apartment for them, a job for my uncle, her brother, and affidavits from family to show that they were able to support this family because the US government was not giving them a single cent. So that was the deal. Also, I recently came upon a document sent to my father. He and his brother in the US bought ship's cards for the family in Vienna. They were refugees in Vienna from World War I, to bring his mother and sisters to the US. And this letter from the lawyer said, and it was in the 30s, sell those tickets, the quota is closed, they will never be able to leave. However, later on, they were chased out by the Gestapo and they managed to get here. So
Right.
these are 2 family history that was part of my life,
Right.
you know, part of my
Yeah.
life.
Okay, so you mentioned the the affidavits, or you mentioned the various sort of paperwork you had to assemble. And yeah, and this is one of the things that the museum goes into some detail in the exhibit. And I also describe in the book, I mean, one of the things you had to get was an affidavit to show that you would not be a burden, an economic burden on the government of the United States. So that meant that you had to, it was a kind of catch-22, because you had to prove that you were, had at least the ability to earn a living, and preferably a job, or if not, people who would support you once you reached the United States. And sometimes it was difficult, oftentimes it was difficult to acquire those all those affidavits. I mean, there was also there's a very famous German Jewish film producer who wrote affidavits for his entire village, basically. The affidavits at different times, this is why I'm saying you can't, it's not a sort of black and white question. At some periods, and depending on which consul you ran into, the consul could be extremely strict about these affidavits. And there are other periods when the regulations were relaxed somewhat, or you've ran into a consul who was actually, fairly sympathetic and didn't, bother too much about every piece of paper being, absolutely correct. So, the regulations were, you have to explain why, suddenly there's this increase of immigration quota visas being issued in the 38, 30 to 40. And part of that reason for that is that they were being less strict in interpreting the quota regulations. Now, you couldn't go, according to the law, you couldn't go above the quota. And when we're talking about Roosevelt, okay, some people say, well, why didn't you just, this is an emergency, why didn't you just ignore the quotas? And I'm trying to describe I'm not either condemning Roosevelt or defending him. I'm just trying to describe his calculations that are going on in his head. I mean, in 1940, there's a presidential election going on in the United States, and immigration is a topic in that election. So Roosevelt is thinking, he doesn't want to be dragged into this immigration debate at a time that he's running running for president. So, you know, he just wants to keep the thing off the front pages of the newspaper. And when you consider Roosevelt, he's very much I mentioned the difference between FDR and Eleanor. Eleanor is thinking in humanitarian terms. FDR is thinking as a politician who is running for re-election and wants to be re-elected, and you know, wants to bring America into the war against Germany, and is, you know, finding a way to juggle all these conflicting pressures on him. So I'm not trying to defend FDR. I'm just trying to say, to give you a sense of what are the political calculations running through his head, and to give you a sense of, you know, what it's like to be a politician. That's, you know, that's pretty much the way it was. But you're correct in saying that, you know, even after the war, it was difficult to reach the United States. There are many obstacles to be overcome. When I mentioned the Meyer family, they were, you know, after Pearl Harbor, they were declared to be enemy aliens. When they reached the United States, they had to register as enemy aliens in New York. They were given a special alien registration. You know, even though they'd been chased out of Nazi Germany, they were considered still as not only as aliens, but as enemy aliens when they reached the United States.
Does anybody else would like to make comment? Oh, Rabbi Goldenberg.
Yes, there were many different ways that people came to this country in 38 and 39. My father-in-law, Albert Meshmar, brought up in Frankfurt, born in Odessa, was forced to go to Lithuania in order to get his exit visa to the United States. He managed to get that. He had an aunt or a cousin in Brooklyn who sponsored him, but he had to go first to Lithuania. I don't know exactly why that happened. Maybe it was because he was born outside of Germany, which he rarely talked about or hardly ever even admitted. And he talks about having his ship docking in Hamburg on the way to the States, and the fear that he would be thrown off the ship, be taken off. He managed to get to this country. He was engaged to Ruth, who was brought up in a little town in Westerwald called Selters. And she and he corresponded for about a year, trying to get her to come over, be able to come over to the States. His cousin wasn't so sure she wanted to allow her. She wanted to put up, I think it was $10,000 that they had to put up in order to assure the their visa. We have a lot of the correspondence in German between Albert and Ruth. She did manage finally to come here. And I don't know if I can show this to you, but I have a photograph of her. I don't know how we can.
Or just show it before them to the camera. Hold it to the camera if you have it.
Oh, okay. That's a way to do it. Sure. Okay. She is boarding. This is her boarding the ship in Hamburg. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Let me see. There.
Right.
She is,
There it is, yeah.
we don't know who took this photograph, but she is the first one in line there, boarding the
That's
ship
her.
in Hamburg. And you can see a Nazi flag behind it. And the name of the ship is the SS St. Louis,
Oh, wow.
which
Is this-
was apparently a voyage after the infamous voyage of the damned.
Wow.
So I'm just speaking of the internal experience
Right.
of these people,
Yeah.
what they were going through. We know what it's like to try to get, to get documents in this country for one thing or the other, and how emotionally upsetting it is. Can you just imagine what these people were going through
Yeah.
emotionally with all of these barriers, etc.
Right. Well, yeah, thank you for that testimony. I think which sort of brings me to, actually, I made it raises a point that I was interested in, is why do some people survive and why were others condemned to death? And I don't sort of explicitly answer that in the book, but I give different case studies so you can reach some conclusions. And, everybody's story is different, but there's a kind of common thread running through all these stories. So they're all different, but they're all the same in some way. So, I was interested in one of the questions I wanted to answer in writing this book is why did some people in this village survive and the people around the corner were they sent to death camps? And I tried to sort of list various factors that are involved, which you might be interested in. One is the date of their immigration application, if they were trying to reach the United States. Was it before or after August 38? Because usually before, suddenly in the middle of 1938, when Nazi persecution started reaching a peak, the waiting lines became so long that it was, you were stuck in the back of the waiting line to get an American immigration visa, and it could take you 2 or 3 years to get a visa. So the date of the immigration application is important. Then there's the question of sponsors, support networks in the US. I mean, some people already had people, friends or relatives in the US that could help them get in. They could write letters to their congressman, or, actually writing a letter to the congressman was sometimes very effective because the congressman would then write to the State Department, and the State Department felt it had to reply to that. Then there's the whole question of, the people who were trying to leave Germany, their education mattered, their wealth mattered, the opportunities they had, their age. I mean, in the Valfer family, you can see the younger Valfers were much more keen to get out than the older ones, and started applying a lot earlier. One went to Palestine, another went to the UK, another went to the US. Whereas the older people, particularly the men, I mean, like Max Valfer, who had a successful business, they thought they would try to hang on in Germany until it became almost too late. Then there's the question of the quotas that I mentioned earlier, which ironically favored German Jews over East European Jews. I mean, if you look at the comparative death rates, it's much higher among Jewish communities in Eastern Europe than it is among German Jews. There's a deportation to Gurs, which ironically gave people a second shot at emigration.
Yeah.
I mean, all these people from
they were deported
Southwest Germany who ended up in Gurs, they were able to approach the US consulate in Marseille and reapply. There were the national security scares in the United States that affected the processing of visas. I mentioned one of them.
What's her name?
I think somebody should mute perhaps Rabbi or somebody should mute their microphone, yeah. and there's the attitude of individual consuls. Some were quite sympathetic, others were hostile. And then there's the question of just pure luck. When you applied for a visa, you can see luck in the Valfa case. You can see luck in the case of the St. Louis passengers, where some ended up in Belgium, some ended up in Holland, some ended up in France, and some ended up in the UK. And if you were lucky enough to end up in the UK, obviously later on, your chances of survival became much higher than if you ended up in countries that were later overrun by the Nazis. So, there are all these different factors, and you really have to examine each case story to decide, what was the factor that ended up being the salvation of a family or an individual, or was a death sentence.
Yeah, this is quite an analysis that you just shared with us about this. Would anybody else like to make a comment, or let me just see. I see Eleanor, but I don't see. Oh, Linda.
Yeah, my grandmother had a sister that was living in Poland, and she showed me a picture of her sister and her son, who was about 12. And the family tried to bring them here. Now, what I'm wondering, my grandmother's sister had the sponsorship of her sister in the US. What percentage of Polish Jews, after the Holocaust started, ultimately came to the United States? And initially, before the Holocaust began, how many Jews were in Poland?
Well, you're asking me questions a little beyond the book, so I may not be accurate in answering. But I don't know whether 4 million or so. I mean, Poland, there were more Jews in Poland than any other country, of course. So, so the predominant, many of the 6 million people who were killed in the Holocaust came from Poland. Perhaps half of them, I don't know exactly. But also partly because of the, the quotas and the immigration, it was much more difficult for East Europeans to get out and to get to a country like the United States. So the death rates among Polish Jews are much higher than German Jews. I mean, I think about 90% of Polish Jews perished. Whereas German Jews, I think it's only about 25%. I say only, but it was, terrible, but it was much less than the Polish, because German Jews had more opportunities to get out than East European Jews.
Well, how many Jews were in Poland about when the Holocaust started, if you know, or an estimate?
Yeah, I've said I thought about many more than in Germany, there were only 500,000 German Jews. Actually, the Kurt Meyer, who I mentioned, he always includes in his talk, when he's talking to these students, he asks them, how many Jews do you think were living in Germany in 1938? And, they say 6 million, 3 million, whatever. And he says 500,000, which is less than 1% of the population. I mean, it's amazing that, this tiny minority was considered such a threat by the Nazis. But, so the German Jewish population was a small proportion of the total population of Germany. In Poland, it was a much larger percentage. I mean, I just off the top of my head, I thought about 3 or 4 million, but you should check that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
We have a question by Betty.
Yes, actually, Mr. Dobbs, you kind of jumped the gun on something I was going to say earlier, but I actually grew up in England, and my mother's family all came from Poland, and many of them were lost for her parents. And my mother was actually born in England. But as a child in England, we knew this family that had come from Germany as refugees. And they were a couple with a child. And the child actually was fostered to a family member, a member of my family. And the couple, because they were considered Germans first and Jews second, and it wasn't looked, they'd had to leave everything. They actually ended up working on a farm in Wales. They had to be farm laborers. So it's actually what you were saying about the family that went to the US. They were treated as, they were considered enemy aliens. So this was the same kind of story, but this was in England, of course.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, the UK, I look at all these families from Kippenheim, and some of them made it to the UK. Some went on the Kindertransport. Actually, one area where the UK was better than the US was allowing child refugees into the country. There was a child refugee bill, which FDR didn't support, Eleanor did support, that would have allowed children outside the quotas to come to the US. But the British, you can criticize their immigration policies in many areas. In some ways they were, stricter than the US, but they did allow, several tens of thousands of children to come on the so-called Kindertransport. And one of the families from Kippenheim, which is fairly typical, actually, they had a family also on the St. Louis. One of these families sent their daughter to England as a on the Kindertransport. Now, as you say, some of particularly the adults, were considered enemy aliens, and they were interned at a certain point, and not for the entire duration of the war, but they had an internment camps in different places, including the Isle of Man, an island in the middle of the Irish Channel. So yeah, these policies applied pretty much everywhere.
Okay. I just want to say also that every day we're learning something new. It's amazing to me. I was watching something on television last night and learned something new. And today I'm learning something new about this. And we really have to keep the memories, keep the stories going. Otherwise they're going to get lost, which would be tragic. Thank you.
So we'll just have, just make sure that everybody, Eleanor, that everybody's asked. So Eleanor, you will.
Yeah, two things. I think it's remarkable to see the photos that Mr. Dobbs showed about the actual loading of those families onto the truck. And I wonder who would have taken those and where were they found? Number two, is it very well known that the Japanese offered to save 1 million Jews in Manchuria? It was called the Fugu Plan. They wanted labor, they wanted Jewish labor. They heard that Jews are good workers, and they wanted to save as many as 1 million people to work in Manchuria. And the head of the Jewish community in the United States, Rabbi Stephen Wise, told the Japanese emissary, "Nope, we don't, my government does not trust yours," and he turned them down.
Sorry, I don't know about the Japanese,
Yes.
what's happening in Japan. What was your first point?
It was how remarkable the photos that you showed of the families being put on the trucks.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I focused on this particular village. And there are not many photographs of deportations where you can actually identify the people in the photographs. There's some, generic photographs of Jews being loaded onto trucks or trains or whatever, but there are very few where you can identify the people in the photograph. And this is partly because Kippenheim was a small place, and the Jewish community was there small, so it was easy to, there's still people who alive who able to identify the people in the photographs. And you can, I mean, I was able, this photograph, for example, there was some question about whether the man here is Mr. Valfa. We were able to figure it out by going to, this is the main street of Kippenheim, and looking at these houses in the background, the shape of the house, and seeing that this photograph, I can identify the precise place where this photograph was taken. And it was taken from immediately outside the Valfa house. So that kind of settled that question. So yeah, this really sort of struck me when I saw these photographs, that this kind of humanized this, you know, the whole question of people's fates. And particularly when I found out that they'd applied for US visas, you know, I wanted to know what happened to them. Were they successful, weren't they? And it's much more, if you can describe things in a personal, human way, it's more, people relate to that better than if you just, you know, using statistics and so on to make your case.